Thank you.
Smriti Mundhra, welcome to FC PopCorn. It's a film companion original podcast. And let me tell you, you are the first filmmaker on it. So we're very excited.
Oh.
Thank you for giving us your time.
What an honor. Thank you.
Now, Vishal is my co-host on this one, and we have so many questions to ask you about the romantics and just your style of filmmaking. So we're going to dive straight in. And if it's okay, I also want to sort of approach this from a lens of a workshop for aspiring documentary filmmakers. So there's some sort of insight for our audience as well. I remember you say, Smriti, in an interview that first steps, of course, was for you to just get the blessings of Yash Raj Films, get Adi's go ahead, and then you got access to the archives in the walls. Now, what does that even mean? Like, what are these archives? Where does one start? How many hours of footage was that? What was step one for you once you'd got Adi's go ahead?
Well, step one was to just watch every single film, from the Yash Raj Films catalog and even prior, basically every film in Yash Chopra's filmography and every film in the Yash Raj Films catalog. Some of them I watched multiple times. And to just make copious notes, with my team. That was step one. And then in terms of the vault, I like to romanticize it and think of it as an actual vault, like a bank vault, like in DuckTales or something. But it's it really is just a really well organized server, that Yash Raj Films has maintained of all their films, and a lot of behind the scenes materials, photos, behind the scenes, video, personal materials, from the family. So it was really starting, after I watched all the films, I started just combing through all of that material, which of course, the biggest highlight, the biggest thrill was finding Yash Chopra and Pamela Chopra's wedding video. So it was that's sort of how the process started, was just trying to absorb what material was available to me, to start crafting a story and see what kind of story emerged.
Mm-hmm.
So, hi Smriti.
Hi.
So when I saw the romantics, basically, the kid inside me, the kid who used to watch movies back in school, who used to collect those DVDs and used to write about cinema in his notebook, it really, resonated with me. And when I saw that Adi Chopra's episode, where you have shown, a notebook where you used to write the prediction, the movies, numbers and everything, and it really made me think about how the journey starts. And is it something very similar to you as well? Has your journey been the same? Are you also were you also like this when you were into a teenage or childhood?
Yeah, certainly. I was, it reminded me so much of myself. I mean, obviously not, I didn't make the longest running film of all time at age 23, like he did. But I do remember, I of course grew up, my father was a filmmaker, so I grew up with a lot of exposure to cinema, Hindi cinema, Hollywood films, art house films from around the world. I was watching films with my dad even before I could really understand what they meant, and he would be talking to me about shot composition and, themes and storytelling and, all of that. And I always, really enjoyed that. But when I started, I got my first internship, in the film industry. I worked at a studio in Hollywood when I was 16 years old, right out of high school. And I was obsessed with that job. I would sit there. This was like, there was internet, but it was like early internet, so there wasn't, you couldn't sit at home and just scroll through IMDb and get everything online and, all of that. So there was a room in the studio that had this computer, this sort of big clunky computer, and on it had this software called Studio System. And in Studio System, you would find all of the projects, basically it was like early IMDb, it was like all of the projects, every director you can imagine, every film that they've done, every news clipping, all of the upcoming projects, the studios would update the system. So I would go in early in the morning, I would stay late at night, I would go in on the weekends, and I just absorbed everything. I was obsessed with going through studio system and finding one link to another link to another link between filmmakers and movies. And I read the trades every day, religiously I was an intern, so I was doing a lot of filing and a lot of photocopying and everything. And when I was asked to photocopy scripts or even contracts, I would sit there at the photocopier and read them while I was photocopying them. So I just became a sponge, and I wanted to know as much as I possibly could. And, I think that's when it was clear to me that this is what I'm meant to do, and this is what I really love doing. So yeah, in that way, it was a similar childhood.
Vishal was telling me right before we started recording about how he worked at a DVD store. And it's just so fascinating how your love for cinema can kind of land you in all of these places. How did you chance upon that notebook that we were just talking about? Like, had he preserved a bunch of these notebooks, Aditya?
Yeah, they are well preserved. And there's many of them. So, and I in when I was, it was the whole making of the series was a process. It started with this intention, of making a series that would tell the story of, who I feel is one of India's greatest filmmakers, and discuss his work, not only as sort of a nostalgia trip, which is very important, but also to tell the story of his career and, the sort of choices that he made as a filmmaker and the craft of, his craft as a filmmaker, but also the ways in which those films reflected where India was, at any given time, and the way that some of those films actually influenced, culture. That sort of was where it started. But then it started, like in any great, documentary or docuseries, as you start researching, as you start, absorbing material, the story just gets richer and richer and deeper and deeper. And eventually I realized, that actually the story of the studio is a very integral part, of this journey. And it reflected all again, sort of what was happening in India at the time, post-liberalization, and, sort of trying to withstand, having the foresight, Aditya having the foresight to sort of try to withstand this corporate colonization that was happening, in India. And then, of course, the family story, was a big part of it that emerged, how much Yash Chopra's family, his wife, Pamela Chopra, his sons, Uday and Adi, really influenced his work. And then eventually how Yashji and Adi became colleagues and creative collaborators. And so as I started, peeling back the layers, of the onion, I just started asking for more material. Do you have any more family photos? Are there photos of you on set? Like, do you have any, behind the scenes, this and that? Do you have any journal entries? And that's sort of when the notebooks emerged.
Yeah, but it took you 2.5 years, if I'm not mistaken, to kind of just chisel and get a structure to this documentary. What would you say was the most sort of challenging part? And was there ever a plan B if, say, Aditya Chopra had not agreed to give you the big interview?
Big interview, yeah. It was, the biggest challenge was, of course, condensing 70 years of history, both of cinema and of the country, and all of those films and all of those interviews into 4 1-hour episodes. So a lot of tough choices had to be made, in terms of who to include, what to include, which films to dive into. And, I think, I knew that there was going to be some conversation about the films that, we didn't do a deep dive into, but, really the decision for each film that was included was around what is this film saying about the story of these filmmakers or the studio or where India was at the time, and that's really what guided everything. But it was a lot of moving pieces around, a lot of trial and error, a lot of trying to squeeze things in that I really loved, that I was trying to find a place for. And, of course, like part of that process, was this sort of duplicitous move on my part where I convinced Adi to record an interview just for his own personal archives, because we were sort of doing all this work and making all this effort without asking him to immediately give me permission to use it. And then I just edited that interview all throughout the series, and so it was a big risk. I mean, it was like, years of work by the time I showed him, the series, and he saw himself in it. And, it would have, if he had either freaked out. Any number of things could have happened. He could have just shut the whole project down. He could have, he could have rescinded permission, to use the interview, or held the line to not use the interview. But somewhere inside me, I felt like it was worth the risk. Especially because in that time that I had gotten to know Aditya just through these off the record conversations, the one thing I really realized about him is that, his biggest, how to say, not weakness, but like his biggest, the thing that he values the most is the creative integrity, of a project. He's a filmmaker first, and when I could show him, that's why I thought, let me show him rather than try to talk him into something. So when I showed him how valuable his input was, in the series, and how, just how informative, his point of view was, and how you really cannot tell the story of Yash Chopra and YRF without, and at least not the definitive story, it would have felt a little half-baked, if
I
we
can't
didn't
imagine it without that really interview is the soul of
Yeah.
it in my books.
Yeah. And thankfully he relented. And the rest is history.